I hate racing games. And I hate cars too. What, you want me to play a racing game with cars in it? Ew! What are you, some kind of nerd? Some kind of freak? Miss me with those cars, dude. They're boring. They make me wait in traffic. They cut me off. Hell no, I would never play a racing game. Now, how do you make someone like this play a racing game? This is actually something that I keep thinking about because it seems that now we've started a series on my main channel where I try to get my girlfriend who doesn't particularly play racing games and has no real interest in cars. And I try to just get her to play various different racing games. And in that process, I try to see how she plays things differently or how she perceives things differently than, let's say, you and I, for example. And it's been an interesting challenge for me to really figure out what games I should get her to play, given that she has zero background on racing games and also generally isn't like super passionate about cars. She doesn't passionately hate them as much as I just portrayed, but she has like zero interest in them. And I think if you're in that position, you're also gonna view racing games a different way. I think racing games in general have gotten this stigma lately that they're kind of more like sports games, you know, like they're not really like a part of gaming culture as a whole. They're just kind of like their own subset for like people who like cars. And so for the series of my main channel, this always gets me to think like, what is a good racing game to give to someone who doesn't like or care about cars, for someone who has no background on racing games. So it turns out there's actually a bunch of games that would fit the criteria and that would actually work surprisingly well. In this video, I just want to kind of like talk about a few of them that I think are particularly interesting. But in the comments, you can obviously share your own picks for games that you would give to someone who hates cars. Now, my first pick is probably not that much of a surprise, but Burnout in general. I'm playing Burnout Revenge here, but I think honestly any Burnout game could work really, really well. And in fact, Burnout 3 was actually one of my first PlayStation 2 racing games way back in the day. And I played it a ton, and I distinctively remember my mom actually like watching me play occasionally and finding it pretty interesting what I'm playing there. And also in general, whenever I see any like online discussions on Reddit or maybe even some YouTube videos by people who don't typically play racing games, Burnout does get mentioned a lot. It's that the focus in Burnout is not really on the cars. It doesn't really matter what you're driving. I just got a vertical takedown. Those are so rare. Oh my god. But it's that the focus is definitely on crashing. Now, I think this is actually a perfect game for people who are particularly frustrated with cars. Interesting. And it's pretty much a perfect stress relief for anyone who is sick of being stuck in traffic or who's sick of, you know, other drivers on the road cutting them off or just behaving really poorly. But other than that, it's obviously just a great game by itself. It feels nice to play, it's fast, the handling is really easy to understand and get a grip of, but a little bit more difficult to master, obviously. But yeah, it's just, the destruction is what really kind of is the focus of the game, and I think this is kind of what carries it for people that don't particularly have any interest in cars and don't know much about them, because quite frankly, it doesn't really matter. Like, you don't need to bring any knowledge for cars or about cars to even like understand and enjoy this game in any kind of capacity. Especially since all the cars here are fictional anyways, so even if you did know a lot about the cars in this game in particular, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change anything. So yeah, Burnout Revenge is definitely a great one, I would say. But what if you strongly dislike the act of racing? What if the simple objective and act of racing is something that just bores you and doesn't interest you? Well, then you have the crash mode, which is pretty much the exact opposite. Because the entire point of this mode is to cause as much chaos as possible. It's not about driving or anything, which is especially good because I would imagine like people who don't like or don't play a lot of racing games and don't like cars, they're typically bad at racing games. And obviously being bad at a game is not fun. So regardless of what game you're playing, if you get frustrated easily with just not really making progress in a game and just being bad at it, it really does not matter here, because you're not driving, like you're causing chaos. This is basically its own separate gameplay, so to say, that has no connection whatsoever to anything. So even if you suck at racing games and you get frustrated for being bad, you have the crash mode, right? You can just enjoy that completely individually and just get really good at this one, even if you are bad at the rest of the game. And yeah, that's why I think Burnout is probably one of my top picks when it comes to giving a racing game, adding a racing game to someone who doesn't like cars. Yeah, it's an easy pick at all. But what if you want to give them a racing game with real cars in it, where they could potentially learn something about real cars, but they're still at least somewhat interested in the game itself? Well, that is when you hand them Forza Horizon. In particular, the first one, but I think the second one could also work quite well. Now, the main difference why I would recommend picking these games instead of the newer ones is because of this. I mean, look at this. This game is insanely over the top. Like, I think while the newer Horizon games became more and more obsessed with just trying to seem as photorealistic as possible, the first one was actually not like that at all. So it did have a fairly realistic look to it. Like, it's a game that is grounded in realism, I would say. But it's coated in a certain kind of art style. Like, pretty much the entire environment looks way more warm. The sunsets and skyboxes have way more color and light to them than in a normal game. Or in real life, I guess. Which I think makes the entire game look way more distinct and way more visually interesting to the average person. Now, obviously, this is more of a car game. So in this instance, we have what I would say is a more realistic handling model that tries to follow like real-world physics a lot more with believable wheel spin and weight shifting and all that sort of stuff. But we also have real cars here. So this could potentially be the first time someone could learn something about cars, especially since this game has a, I would say, surprisingly in-depth tuning system where you can swap out particular parts of the car for other ones, and you actually learn a little bit about the actual inner workings of an engine, which is quite cool. But it manages to just kind of wrap all of these like car-specific elements into into kind of like a coating that is a little bit more gamified, and I think that's what really is the key with Forza Horizon. It presents all of these sim elements like tuning and buying specific cars for specific events, in a gamified manner, in a gamified way, and it does this with, for example, obviously the story, which, I mean, I gotta admit, like, it's decent in this game, but it's not really the main focus, right? Like, you just appear to this festival that you just want to be good at, and you have all of these, like, rivals you meet along the way who only have, like, a little bit of character. They only get shown, like, very briefly. So while the story, I would say, does a pretty good job of hooking you in, it kind of, like, loosens up once you're in the game, and it just kind of becomes, like, a side thing. But despite that, you obviously have the festival atmosphere, which is very unique to Forza Horizon and has kind of become a bit of a standard for a lot of racing games these days, to the point where a festival racer is kind of like a dreaded term these days. But I still think that the first Forza Horizon still did it the best, because the festival was really the main focus of this game and really like the main point. I mean, you can see it even on the map. It's in the very, very center of the map, It's not like chucked to the side somewhere like on some of the newer Horizon games, where you might also have like several festival sites across the map, but they're all just way smaller than the one from the first game. So it takes up a bit more of a focus here, as you can see. Like, this feels incredible. Like, it's just so unlike any other racing game you would see, with like all of these like massively over the top, almost like larger than life environments here in this game that you only really get in the first game. Now, I would say the second game also would work quite well. I think they already shrunk down the festival theme in the second game a lot, and I think also in general just sanitized the game quite a bit. Like, you don't really have like any rivals to drive against anymore in the second game, for example. But I still think that game still hits the same notes, where it really puts like environment design and vibes over realism. And I think if you have someone who just likes to explore in a racing game, who just likes games with a very, very strong, distinct atmosphere and feel, I think Horizon is actually a fantastic game for it. And the music helps a lot with this one as well. Like, the music here is also one of the strongest points of this game, I would say. And I think stands the test of time really, really well. Spare for like the odd dubstep song here and there that I don't know if anyone still genuinely enjoys. But yeah, Horizon 1 and maybe also 2, I think also great picks for what a non-racing game person could enjoy. But what if all of that is still a little bit too much? If the handling is still like a little bit too complicated, a little bit too difficult for them, and also they just kind of don't vibe too much with the festival stuff, and maybe also aren't really interested in the story, what could you give them then instead? Well, how about one of the most successful racing games ever made? Arguably the game that turned millions into car guys. So Need for Speed Most Wanted is more of an arcade racer compared to Forza Horizon. I would say the handling and obviously the graphics as well are still mostly grounded in realism. So it might still be a little bit more difficult for someone to get a grasp on this who maybe only ever played Mario Kart. In fact, that's exactly what you could see when my girlfriend tried to play this game. So it's not 100% easy, but after some time, I would say the average person does manage to like get a grip of it, so to say. So it is definitely a little bit more accessible in that regard, because all the cars, they have like tons and tons of grip. They don't lose traction as easily. But obviously the main draw with this game is, well, for one, the story, obviously. But I think in particular just the power fantasy. I think that is really what was the main draw with this game and why this game became so successful and became so beloved and still has such a massive status even today. It's just the insane power fantasy this comes with that, you know, you just kind of start from nothing, you get everything taken away from you, and you build yourself up to become the best racer, the most notorious racer, and along the way, you make an absolute mockery of the police force, you trash hundreds of police cars and, you know, other stuff, the rest of the city along the way. I think that's really the main draw for this. And if you're wondering why I was driving a pink Porsche the entire time, this is literally the car the game got me from this, like, quick play randomizer. I'm not even kidding. Like, it is pretty much the one game that makes you feel like you're doing something bad, you know? And I think this is what makes this game stand out so much more, even amongst the rest of the Need for Speed series. It just made you feel badass. It just made you feel like an outlaw, you know? And I think this power fantasy that comes with it is really, really, really important, especially for, you know, a Need for Speed game in particular. And I think it's really the main draw with this. Now, you can also learn a thing or two about cars here, but not really that much, I would say. But the customization aspect definitely stands out, especially for people who like character creators or like, you know, I don't know, building stuff in Minecraft, for example, I don't know. Generally, people who like customization in various other games will definitely get along with the customization here as well and will find that to be appealing. That being said, the customization Most Wanted was already a bit of a step back compared to Underground. But it's still here, and I think it can still pretty much satisfy a lot of people just based on whatever's in this game. And needless to say, it worked. You know, I think this game was like the perfect blend of stuff that people really wanted out of a Need for Speed game, and at the time out of a racing game in general. It kind of released during the peak era of edgy video games, which I also made an entirely separate video on if you're interested in checking that out. It just hit the zeitgeist perfectly, and I think really cemented Need for Speed's identity as a street racing game with customization and cops. Now, obviously, both of these things have, you know, existed individually. So, previous Need for Speed games, the older ones from the 90s, had cops in them, and Underground introduced customization. But this was the one that put it all together for the first time. And I think that's what really made it click for a lot of people. And I think it can still make it click for a lot of people who don't like racing games or don't like cars, but would try one out even today. I think this game still does its job really, really well even today. And as such, I think has aged really gracefully. However, that being said, I can also imagine some people would not like the edginess. Some people might find it kind of cringe. Some people might dislike the colors of the game, the piss filter it comes with pretty much. At the end of the day, while I do think it aged really well, it doesn't mean that it's not a product of its time. And some people might not really vibe with that all that much. Especially with a story where everyone is just kind of acting like a tough guy, which like some people might also just bounce right off of. So what is the alternative to this? Well, unfortunately, we gotta look towards Ubisoft. The Crew, I think, is actually a genuinely good racing game to hand to someone who doesn't like cars or racing games. However, only the first one. I'm not sure if anyone would really like vibe too much with The Crew 2 and The Crew Motorfest, but I think The Crew 1 is actually much more interesting for the average gamer, I would say. I think it's in particular with the way the game introduces itself. So The Crew really just hits it off with the story right away. And I gotta be honest, the story is fairly generic. It's the kind of like average revenge plots, undercover plot we've already seen dozens of times in movies. However, in saying that, I think it still does its job quite well of just kind of... Zoe, please shut up, man. As I was saying, it still does its job quite well to just draw you into the world It is still gritty, just like Most Wanted, but not to like an overt level, I would say. Like, it doesn't really make you cringe, or it doesn't have the potential to make you cringe, I would say. It plays things a little bit more straight. So you have a story that, albeit a little bit generic, I think does a good job of drawing you in. But I think besides the physics, I would say besides the story, I think this game is perfect for anyone who usually likes open world games because, well, look at it. The map is massive. Like, you will never actually run out of things to find and explore. This is perfect for the kind of experience where you just want to like move around the map, explore new places, find stuff. Because there is actually a lot of stuff to find here. So for example, you have various car wrecks that you can discover, which will then, you know, eventually unlock a new car for you to use. But also all of the various landmarks, which I've already talked about in previous games, which I am a big fan of, where you actually can learn a thing or two about the crew and its map. And I think that's really, really cool. And beyond that, I think this is probably also the easiest game in terms of handling, aside from maybe Burnout, but I would say Burnout's Break to Drifting can be a little bit hard to grasp for people who don't really play racing games. Ouch. Whereas this game has a pretty simplified grip handling, I would say. So the cars look like, you know, they control realistically and normal, but every car has like tons and tons of grip. Like, especially because the crash detection here is very, very lenient. I'm not sure if I can show this, but if you basically, okay, maybe not this time properly, but basically if you're at high speeds and you just barely hit like a lamppost or whatever, it will actually just push you to the side instead of having you crash entirely. So it is very lenient with its handling and its driving, which I think makes it great as a starting point for any racing game newbie. And with the map and the story, I think there's enough here to just draw the average gamer in, because in a lot of ways this is just an average Ubisoft game, like at least in terms of structure. So you do have the story, obviously, which you can follow with dedicated story missions, which, by the way, are also really cool and I think keep the game interesting. There's the fact that it's not just racing here, which might also, as I said earlier when I talked about Burnout, if someone isn't really interested in racing and finds the act of racing itself kind of boring, well, you barely do any racing in this game. Most of the story missions are unique stuff where you need to collect stuff or run from the cops or just complete some kind of goal, some kind of target. And races are just sprinkled in every now and then. So if you have someone who actually quite enjoys the average Ubisoft or open world game, I think The Crew is a perfect game to hand them because they would probably feel right at home, honestly. But what if you wanted to get someone into something more official? Because all of these things that we talked about were mainly street racing focused games. And honestly, when it comes to track races, there wasn't really anything that really came to mind particularly. But there is one game I can think of that I think could be a nice bridge to getting someone interested in at least one official kind of racing. This is Dirt 2, and it is, without any doubt, the one game that got me into rally. Now, I did actually play a few rally games before this one. In fact, WRC2 Extreme for the PlayStation 2 was my very first racing, or first game in general on the PlayStation 2. I would say this is the game that really got me hooked on this entire genre of racing, because it does such a good job of, once again, just coating the sport in a way that it's just interesting. You know, like, it gamifies so many elements about it. Ironically enough, this actually did the festival stuff before festival races were even cool in the first place, so it definitely gets props for that. But this game, more than any other racing game that tries to depict a real-world sport, a motorsport that is, it just does it so much better than, I feel like, all of them. And it's because this game just oozes with style more than any other dirt game, more than any other rally game, more than any other game that tries to depict a real-world motorsport. Now, this game does take a few creative liberties. Like, for example, this track here does not exist in real life. So it isn't trying to be 1000% authentic. The rally stages are also completely fictional. But that doesn't really matter. Like, for someone who doesn't care about racing or cars, that kind of stuff doesn't really matter. In fact, I would say it works more in favor for this game because they managed to make the locations and the tracks way more visually interesting than they would be in real life for the most part. And besides that, the handling of this game is actually fairly easy, like, which is interesting because Rally is one of the most demanding motorsports of all time, because it requires an absolutely absurd amount of car control. But this game just makes it work. This game actually makes it work in a way where it is really accessible, and I think if you have little experience with racing games, you should still be able to navigate just fine. But later on in the game, when the cars get faster and the stages get more tricky, that's where you will actually need to bring some kind of car control. You have some kind of like RPG elements here as well, with XP and money that you can spend on stuff, which is kind of cool. And you obviously have this, right? Like, you have actual 3D environments that they use for the menus. This was such a cool thing that the developers back in the day were doing with pretty much all their games. But yeah, you know, you're in this like beat up trailer in the middle of the festival, and you're just, you know, trying to go places and seeing where you could go next. On top of that, this game also has a surprising amount of variety. I think a lot of rally games obviously only ever feature rally, which, I mean, for the most part is perfectly fine for those kinds of games. But they did actually go a few steps further with this one and featured other stuff. So what we're doing here is obviously rally, and it's also made fairly simple because you have a mini-map at the top, so you don't actually need to pay that much attention to your co-driver, which does take away like one of the major roadblocks with rally and getting into rally, which is understanding the all of the calls, basically all of the co-driver calls. But even then, if you still want that, you can obviously still disable the minimap and just listen to the calls. But it just helps to make this game more accessible, more playable for someone who has zero experience with these kinds of games. But besides rally, as we've seen earlier, there is rallycross in this. You get to drive all kinds of cars like buggies, trucks, pickup trucks, and you get to drive them through all kinds of locales. I remember there were some fun modes in here as well, like I'm not sure if it was called Breakout or Smash Out or whatever. But there are more like gamified modes here as well that aren't trying to represent any kind of like real world motorsports. But yeah, this is the game that turned me into a rally enthusiast, and that's after already having played various rally games. This is the one that really did it for me, and I think it is thanks to the vibe, once again, the atmosphere, the music in this game as well is fantastic. But also just how they managed to gamify everything, how they managed to make everything just play nicely together, how it's not super hard to understand and get a grip of. Most of the stages here are also fairly forgiving, you know, besides like some of the later ones. So while I couldn't really come up with any like great track races that are good for like, you know, getting someone into track racing, I would say Dirt 2 is a fantastic game to get someone into rally racing, get someone interested in this kind of motorsport, which I think is awesome. But what if none of that clicks for someone? What if all of the stuff that I showed here does simply not click because these games just still aren't gamified enough, don't have an interesting plot, don't have any interesting, unique elements to them? Well, then there's only one game that I think can still do the job. Then look no further than Driver San Francisco. So from all of the games that I showed in this video, I think this is the single best game, racing game, to give someone who hates cars and racing games. Because not only does this have easily the best story out of any racing game, I don't think there's really much debate for this. It also is the only game with a mechanic that I think is completely unique and, you know, only this game has, which is the shift mechanic. So you can hover above the entire city here and just zoom in and jump into any car you see on the road, which is such a cool mechanic to this day, and I cannot believe this hasn't really been utilized again, because it's so damn cool, just zapping into any car you see on the road.
Plans, kid. I told you, Mother, I'm not a damn kid anymore.
And since you're basically zapping into the bodies of various actual people, you might have a passenger in the car, and you just kind of get put into this situation where you have to just kind of like, or like your main character has to just kind of like act along, basically, to not give up the ruse that they just took over their body. Which, like, if you've never heard of this game before, this sounds absolutely wild, and it's because this game is super wild. Barrel roll?
Mom, get a damn grip.
Okay, maybe not. But yeah, in terms of just premise, both when it comes to the story and the gameplay, I think this game wins by default. It has such an interesting premise. It starts off fairly tame in terms of story. Like, at first the story seems just kind of whatever, and it's clearly building off of the previous driver games, I would say. But I think it picks up really quickly after that. And especially once the shift mechanic gets introduced, it's just interesting. It's just interesting. I don't think I need to explain why or what makes it interesting. But in terms of gameplay, it allows for really creative approaches to how you do races, how you do missions. Which also, this game doesn't just focus on racing. Racing is the least you do in this game, really. It does have racing, but most of the story are extremely creative missions that you will never ever see again in any other racing game or game in general, for that matter. Like, this game is in many ways your playground where you can just experiment and mess around, do all kinds of things during or outside of the story. Now, when it comes to handling and physics, I think this might be a little bit more on the tougher end, because the cars here tend to oversteer a lot. This was kind of done on purpose, obviously, to make the game feel a little bit more action heavy. But yeah, cars lose traction fairly easily on low speeds. And I think for a beginner, it might be a little bit difficult to just react on time and not counter-steer too much, or, you know, try to counter-steer like the exact right amount. That's a police chase going on there, cool. Which we could join, by the way, just to show this off. So if I zap out of this car, we could now either zap into the escapee and try to get him to escape, or alternatively, we could zap into any of the cop cars and then try to bust the escapee. Like, it's really up to you, really. And that's exactly the kind of stuff that only this game does. And I think this is what makes this game so genius. But as I said, in terms of handling, you know, it's a little bit difficult. And I will also say that some of the later missions get really hard. Some of the last couple of missions in the game are no joke. And I think if this is someone's first racing game, they will probably struggle and eventually despair. So that's like really my main caveat with this, is that in terms of handling and some of the later missions, it is a little much, I think, for a beginner. But I think it does its job better than any other racing game in terms of hooking the player and getting them to actually be interested and invested in a racing game and wanting to play it more. I think this game does it better than pretty much any other racing game out there, and I think for that, this is probably my #1 pick. If you have someone out there who does not like racing games and doesn't like cars, but you want them to really try one, you should probably give them this game. This is probably the best pick out of them all. But this was only a slice of all the racing games you could potentially give to someone. There's obviously countless more out there. I just really wanted to focus on a few specific ones, specifically games that feature real cars in them. Obviously stuff like Flat Out, this, you know, kind of like fulfills the same power fantasy as a Burnout, for example. So you could also give them Flat Out 2 or Ultimate Carnage, especially because those games also have the stunt mode. So if someone just hates the entire game, they can still play the stunt mode and enjoy that. But also stuff like Ridge Racer or Crazy Taxi, like the super arcadey stuff. I think that stuff also works. But if I missed anything, let me know in the comments. What is a racing game that you would give to someone who hates cars and racing games? I think this is a really interesting topic, because oftentimes you'll find out that the exact games you would give them are some of the most popular and successful games out there. And in general, this is a super interesting topic and also really helpful for me in deciding what racing games I should give my girlfriend next for my series on the main channel. So definitely let me know your ideas and opinions on this in the comments below. And with that, I'm up for today. Thanks so much for listening. And until next time, take care, take it easy. And as always, peace. See you guys.